So today we're going to be talking about uchi mawashi geri. Now, uchi mawashi geri is similar to our kakato geran mawashi geri in that, unlike most other kicks where we're actually rotating the hips towards the target, in these kicks we're rotating the hips away from the target. Now, when we're throwing a technique like a mawashi geri, there's a lot of different areas of the body and joints that we can produce power over. So it starts from the foot where we push off from the floor, and then we're getting a lot of power from the flexion of the hip, and then obviously we're extending the knee at the final portion of the kick to get power into the kick. When we're performing our uchi mawashi geri, it's not so easy to get the power in the technique because we can't really use that same amount of push off from the floor and hip flexion. We can use our knee extension, but it's in a position of external rotation of the hip, which makes it slightly awkward to get a lot of power into that hip extension. So in order to get enough speed and power in the technique, we have to really use our hips as efficiently as possible. Now, some people really struggle to use this kick effectively, and some people are obviously very effective with it. Now, some of that is technique, and we'll go over some technique elements in a moment. Some of it is just genetic in terms of how our hips are built. In order to throw a uchi mawashi geri, you need to have sufficient amount of hip external rotation. Unlike a mawashi geri, your hips need to internally rotate to throw the kick at this angle. With an uchi mawashi geri, your hips need to rotate outwards. And if you lack that range of motion, it doesn't mean that you can't utilize the technique, but it does make it a lot more difficult. So for someone like me, I have very limited internal rotation. As you can see here, yep, that's about as far as it goes. So not great for our mawashi geri. However, I have a lot of hip external rotation. So I can go quite a long way in this direction. So for someone like me with my relative hip mobility, the uchi mawashi geri is actually a really appropriate kick and something that is quite easy for me to perform.
Thanks for watching, guys. If you haven't already, please check out my book, The Science of Striking, a complete guide to strength and conditioning for combat sports.
When we're throwing our kakato geran mawashi geri, the hip movement is a lot simpler in that we're opening up the kick, opening up the kicking leg, and then rotating the hips as we're bending the knee to perform the kick. With uchi mawashi geri, it's a little more complicated. We want to be turning the hips as we extend the leg out, but we need to have a counter movement to actually build some momentum into the kick. So how we often see the kick being thrown is with a rotation, a rapid rotation towards the target, followed by a rotation of the hips back. So it needs to be really well timed. You're basically using the rotation towards to build up some elastic tension in the hip of the supporting leg, and then you're using that to almost bounce back into the kick. And this is why we often see this performed as a feint. So obviously you can use the feint to telegraph your opponent, making them think that you're going to throw a different technique, often using a mae geri or a geran mawashi geri, and to try and enter the technique that way. But the feint also allows us to get that hip movement. So we're using that feint to rotate towards the target, build up tension in that supporting leg, and then snap back. So even if you're not throwing a feint, it makes sense to almost position the body as if you're going to throw, such as a geran mawashi geri or a mae geri, off the kicking leg in order to use the power from the kicking leg when you push off the floor to transmit that force into the supporting leg and then use that to get power into the kick.